I've pressed the button.
I've pressed the button as well.
We've got to have a better sync up, but we just don't.
You want me to be like lock and load? Let's go. Let's do this.
Yeah, I want like a code. Hello and welcome back to a podcast about murder. I'm Freya and I'm here again with our friend and confidant, Jem, to explore another case today. How are you, Jem?
I'm good. How are you?
I am all right. Pretending that we didn't ask how each other was
Literally
already.
just have this conversation.
Yeah. So this time we're looking at another more historical case. We're talking 1884 to 1908. This time it's a female serial killer who was active in Illinois and Indiana, believed to have 14 or more victims.
All three, the first episodes have all been in America at like the turn of the century.
Completely unintentional. And the hilarious thing about it was when we were discussing like the episodes that we were going to do this season, I was specifically talking about like variety and trying to mix it up and also trying to not do so many American things, and yet it ended up being that's like half the season.
Yeah. But the second half will shift to something else.
Yes, but that's just how things
It's just
ended
funny
up.
that that's how it's worked out.
Yeah. We are talking about the Norwegian American Belle Gunness, nicknamed Hell's Belle. And that's, of course, the title that I wanted to use for the episode, but couldn't because I'd already had an episode, if you remember, called Hell's Bells, which was about the British child murderer Mary Bell. But here we are.
If this conversation hasn't given you an indication as to like our planning capacities.
Our little processes that we go through. Belle Gunness is actually suspected of upwards of 40 murders, which is quite a lot. Most of these were men, but some of them were her own children. And the interesting thing about Belle is nobody knows what happened to her in the end. But we'll get into that a little later. Before we start, this episode will contain talk of violence against children, as I just mentioned. That's our warning for today. Other than, murder, regular stuff.
Which, the title's a pretty good indication of what's to come in that regard.
I would hope so. But, just in case you've turned the wrong corner and you're in the wrong place, turn back now. Belle Gunness was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth on November 11th, 1859, in Selbu, Norway. She was the youngest of 8 children born to Paul and Berit Storseth. Paul was a stonemason and the family lived on a small farm in Bygde. I know I just butchered all of those pronunciations. And if my Norwegian friend listens to this, which she does, I believe, on occasion, listen to these.
I was going to say, couldn't you just get her to say it and then dub her in?
Oh my God, that would be hilarious. But there you go. I apologize for any poor pronunciation in this episode. But moving on. Belle, then Brynhild, dreamed of a life in the United States. Starting work on neighbouring farms at 14, it took her until she was 22 to save up enough money to pay for her journey to New York. I feel like that's such a classic story, an image of the time. It's very romanticised, the Statue of Liberty and so on. Statue of Liberty wasn't even there yet at this time, actually. It was a few years later, I think. But, that's such a, classic sort of American dream type thing.
But it is at that period of time as well where it is literally like, you can go there and do anything. You could be a new person. As
Belle, or Brynhild, was going through the immigration processes at Castle Garden in Manhattan, she gave the authorities a new name to mark her new life, Belle. And for the rest of this episode, although I'll go back and talk about her at times when she was known as Brynhild, I'll still call her Belle so that it's not confusing. So Belle is for now. Belle wasn't completely at sea in this new country. Her sister Nellie had already lived in Chicago for a few years, so Belle headed there. She lived with her sister and her sister's husband for a few years. Notably, Belle worked at a butcher's shop during this time, where her role involved, naturally, the cutting and preparation of animal meats. not a particularly unusual or necessarily dark job in most people's eyes. It's a job, but when taken in context with what happens later, it always makes for a grim element to the story. In 1884, aged 25 and still based in Chicago, Belle married her first husband, Mads Sorensen. I'm not sure where he was from, but sounds like he was Scandinavian as well. I'm not sure if he was Norwegian specifically, but soon afterwards, strange things began to occur around Belle. 2 separate fires claimed both the home they lived in and the business they'd set up, a candy store. This business venture had not been very fruitful, so as you can see, there's an obvious motivation there. In the case of each mysterious fire, Belle and her husband collected insurance money, which they used to purchase a new house. Belle apparently gave birth to 4 children by her first husband in the following years: Caroline, Axel, Myrtle, and Lucy. The births were said to fuel gossip among neighbours who didn't believe they'd ever seen Belle looking pregnant. Belle's first 2 children, Caroline and Axel, died as babies. Their deaths, which presented as acute colitis, otherwise known as bowel inflammation, could have been the result of poisoning, but due to the time period that this happened, it's impossible to know that for sure. What is known is that the babies died with large insurance policies having been taken out on them, which Belle collected.
Yeah.
Not sounding super innocent, but again, no, not conclusive. At this time as well, it's not uncommon for babies to die of illnesses that these days they wouldn't die of. So two babies dying in a normal family, which these days would be like these days in where we live would be considered very unusual, but back then wasn't really.
Well, I guess it's also like, what I found suspicious was the insurance policy, but as you're saying, like, if it's common for children to die, you would
it would be very common to insure them. Yes, I would think so. The United States Census for the year 1900 recorded Mads and Belle as parents of 4, but only 2 living children, Myrtle and Lucy, obviously. A third seemingly fostered child, Morgan Couch, also known as Jenny Olsen, was counted as living with them.
And they're still living in Chicago at this point.
Well, they're still living in Illinois. I'm not 100% sure if they're still living in the Chicago area or not, but she's still in Illinois. And this child who lives with them, it seems like a kind of like an unofficial fostering situation, which might have been something that happened quite regularly back when the sort of state system was less developed. They wouldn't really be keeping track of children in the same way when they became sort of orphans and stuff. So a sort of local family might take them in to avoid them being taken into like just a random orphanage and probably treated poorly and stuff like that. So not really sure about the origins of Morgan, or Jenny as she's known, but that she lives with them. On July 30th, 1900, Belle's husband Mads suddenly died. According to Belle, Mads had complained of a headache for which she had offered him medicine. He went for a rest and Belle found the body when she checked on him later. Mads' symptoms were said to be consistent with strychnine. Is that how you say that? Strychnine.
I think I've heard strychnine, but I'm not confident in that.
Why do I never check? I just never check how to say anything. Strychnine.
It can be strychnine. Or strychnine in the US.
Okay, so it's accurate for me to say strychnine.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't say I'm fundamentally against American pronunciation.
But that also explains why I've heard it as an American pronunciation, because I bet it's been on like a crime show.
Oh, yeah.
Like CSI kind of thing.
Anyway. Mads' symptoms were said to be consistent with strychnine poisoning, which is a pesticide, but his death was ruled as heart failure and not suspicious, and an autopsy was never performed. Mads had not 1 but 2 insurance policies on his life. One was due to expire on that day, July 30th, the same day that the other was set to begin. So it was that Belle was able to collect on both the active insurance policies, which was a total of $5,000. Today, according to the inflation calculator I found online for the US dollar, that amount would be close to $150,000.
Jesus.
So not nothing. And
I mean, the timing is just too suspicious for this to be a coincidence.
with the money, Belle left this dark chapter of life behind her, as anyone might, and started fresh in the neighbouring state of Indiana. Her remaining 2 children, Myrtle and Lucy, accompanied her, of course, as did Jenny Olsen, her foster child. In Indiana, on the outskirts of Porte, Belle used her insurance payout to purchase a pig farm. She became involved with a new man, himself a widower with a young daughter, and a butcher by trade, work that Belle was also familiar with. Peter Gunness was also a Norwegian immigrant, adding to what the two had in common. They were married in April 1902. Tragedy struck just a week after the wedding, when Peter's baby daughter passed away. At the time of her death by unknown causes, she was alone with her stepmother Belle.
So he's also like a very recent widower.
You would think so if this is this child is very young. And it wouldn't be long before Belle became a widow once more. That very December 1902, a meat grinder fell from a shelf in the kitchen onto Peter Gunness's head, killing him. The coroner was suspicious.
Yeah.
And locals were said to be as well, but ultimately the incident went down as an accident. And you guessed it, Peter's life was insured, and Belle collected another $3,000 or almost $90,000 today.
I had no idea that the insurance system was so well established at this point in time.
It was also incredibly easy to defraud because of its newness, but also because of the lack of other administration and checks and balances around other things. So insurance claims and frauding those types of systems was so normal back in this time, and you would just be like, I guess I'll just burn down my shop, it didn't do that well, and then I'll have enough money to put down a down payment on my next business, kind of thing. That's quite a common thing, I think. Belle was already pregnant by this time with a son, and she gave birth to him in May of 1903. He was named Philip. Not everyone was turning a blind eye to what was going on. It's said that Jenny Olsen, the foster child, told school friends exactly what happened to Peter, saying, "My mama killed my papa. She hit him with a meat cleaver and he died. Don't tell a soul."
I'm just thinking, if, according to Jenny, he was killed by a meat cleaver in the head, his skull must have been so
fucked up,
utterly deformed, for them to not be able to distinguish between a slicing wound and just a meat grinder falling on someone.
It's also possible that if you that a child could have some of the facts wrong. She could have meant hit him with a meat grinder, or she could have meant something else, but I don't know. But that's what she said anyway. But you're right. I think we can maybe surmise that the attack was of such a nature that the head was in a bad place to be identified what happened to it. And perhaps this is Belle's explanation. In 1906, Jenny disappeared.
Oh.
When neighbors inquired as to her whereabouts, Belle claimed that Jenny was away attending a school in Los Angeles, California.
That's so far away.
It's
for the
very
time.
far away. It's like she picked the absolute furthest place possible so that it would be impossible to sort of know whether that was true or not. If you're living in rural Indiana. And during this time, you're not going to be able to check up on that story in any way. You can't see if Jenny's updating her Facebook or anything.
Yeah.
Farmhand Ray Lamphere began working at Belle's pig farm in 1907. Among his many chores was servicing Belle, to put it bluntly, as he often bragged to locals of this extra duty he was performing. And he wasn't the only man hanging around the pig farm. Belle's revolving door of handsome suitors surprised the local community, given that she apparently wasn't considered conventionally attractive. Belle was described as rugged, or as having a somewhat masculine appearance and physicality. She stood at least 5'7", although probably around 5'9", and weighed around 100 kilograms or over 200 pounds. The height isn't I'm not saying that because you're a tall woman you're necessarily masculine or anything, but I'm just trying to give an idea of what she looked like. She was strong and tough, used to the manual labour of farm work and butchery. It was claimed that Belle was so physically strong she had been seen to lift a piano that weighed 300 pounds or 136 kilograms by herself.
That can't be real.
I don't think I don't think we're to imagine her holding it with one hand,
Like bench pressing it.
or like, twiddling it on the top of her finger like a basketball or something. I don't think that's what we're to imagine. But that perhaps she was able to move something of that size herself, like, drag it or something. But yeah, so she's tall, she's strong, and her face is like she's not considered, I think everyone's got beauty to someone and in some way, but like the locals were surprised that she had all this male attention because they didn't consider her to be very feminine or very, dainty and attractive and stuff like that. And if she wasn't a murderer, I'd be saying like, hey, good for her. But when meeting with suitors that she attracted to the farm with personal ads placed in nearby cities, Belle showed another side. She had her hair done and wore elegant clothing as she accompanied the men on carriage rides and walks. You might wonder if these men were at least partially interested in Belle's money, as she advertised herself as a widow, owner of a large farm in a good area. But Belle expressly stated in her ads that she was looking for a man with a financial situation on par with hers. And the men that were coming to visit her were willing to give her money to help her pay the loss of her mortgage on the farm. So it's not like these were just guys who were just turning up. They didn't care necessarily. They just wanted the money. They were actually interested in her so much they were willing to give her their own money. John Moe of Minnesota was one of these, and he brought over $1,000 as a gift on his trip to meet Belle. He was the first of these suitors known to have disappeared, not long after his arrival. Subsequently, Ole B. Budsberg, Henry Gerholt, Olaf Svenhurud, Olaf Lindblom, and Andrew Helgelien all disappeared after visiting Belle, all bearing contributions to her mortgage, mostly in the thousands of dollars. Ole Budsberg, he had even mortgaged his own land in Wisconsin in order to get enough money together just to offer her a gift of money. So, she was really ringing these guys out somehow with her charms. She needs to offer classes or something. This is impressive. But Belle cleverly identified and exploited the weaknesses of her victims. And these men were all Norwegian immigrants like herself. And as a result of this, they were all very lonely and they were looking for someone who they could relate to. Some of them were very elderly and they were getting maybe more they really wanted the companionship. So because they had immigrated so far and long distance communication was difficult or impossible, many of the men were completely cut off from their friends and family back in Norway, and they were very isolated in the US, so they could go missing and nobody would know.
Yeah.
And Belle painted herself as the perfect Norwegian wife to love them and remind them of home.
Yeah.
She would talk about how she would cook their favorite Norwegian food. They could speak Norwegian together. They'd have this amazing connection. And they all fell for her ads, which were all placed in Norwegian language newspapers. And then for her letters, which she wrote, she would write them these wonderful letters full of love and promises of partnership and everything they were going to do together. So yeah, it was very, very cold, calculating kind of behavior to pick up on, knowing in a way from her own experience that these people were going to be very vulnerable and very isolated and therefore easy for her to exploit. George Anderson of Missouri came to LaPorte offering a deal. He'd pay the mortgage if Belle would marry him. He stayed the night in Belle's guest room at the farm, but abruptly left when he woke in the night to see her standing over him, glaring at him in the darkness.
Oh my God.
He believed he was about to be attacked and got the first train from LaPorte back to Missouri. He was the one man who left Belle's farm alive, as far as we know.
That is absolutely terrifying.
Can you imagine? I mean,
I would have done exactly the same. Just get out of there.
And the victim names I listed earlier on were just the names we know. It's thought that many more men disappeared after visiting Belle's farm and that they were just never reported because literally no one knew who they were or that they were missing. Locals claimed a different man stayed with Belle each week. and that she introduced them all as her cousins, and after a while each one would disappear. Those who've studied Belle's case believe this puts her victim count as potentially in the 40s, as I mentioned earlier, although we only know, like, for sure these sort of 14 ones, although that count includes the children, I think.
Are the children still alive at this point?
At this point, she has 4 living children, yes. They are Lucy, Myrtle... I'm sorry, 3. Lucy, Myrtle, and Philip.
Because Jenny has allegedly sent to California.
Yes, she's living it up in California. And the oldest 2 children didn't make it out of babyhood.
Right.
For whatever reason. In January 1908, Andrew Helgelien, who I mentioned earlier at the end of the list, arrived at Belle's farm. He would be the last of her victims. He was a farmer himself from South Dakota and had taken out his entire savings, $2,900, as an offering to Belle. This is where things come to an interesting culmination, and this could get a little bit confusing, so stay with me. But hopefully it's clear. By this time, Belle's farmhand, Ray Lamphere, who, if you remember, was her employee who slept with her, and he had become very attached to Belle.
Right.
He was becoming increasingly angry and jealous at the endless male visitors to the farm. And once Andrew showed up, it was the last straw for Ray. The relationship between Ray and Belle turned sour, and she fired him. Andrew, of course, disappeared, and then Belle deposited a large sum of money into the bank not too long afterward. But this time, there was someone paying attention. Andrew's brother, Asler, became concerned and contacted Belle, who he knew was meant to be meeting Andrew. Belle tried to feign ignorance, saying she thought Andrew had gone back to his home in Chicago, but that maybe he'd gone back to Norway. Andrew's brother didn't buy it.
Way too big of a swing.
Yeah. He wouldn't give up hope of finding his brother, and his determination threatened to unravel everything Belle had built. So she didn't count on him having someone that cared about him, basically. Meanwhile, the animosity between Ray and Belle wasn't dampening. Belle visited a local lawyer and told him that Ray's anger at her over the relationship and the firing made her worried that he would seek revenge and perhaps try to kill her. She asked the lawyer to help her make a will. She also told the sheriff that Ray was trespassing on her property and that he had threatened to burn her house down.
She's sowing the seeds of something here.
Right, so you're following me. That same night, Belle's house burns down. A farmhand sleeping in a room on the second floor of the house awoke to the smell of smoke and managed to escape, running into town to get help. But by the time anybody could get there, the fire had turned the farmhouse to rubble. In the basement, the bodies of Belle's 3 children, Myrtle, who was 11, Lucy, 9, and Philip, 5, were discovered, as well as the body of a woman, which they assumed to be Belle. But strangely, the woman's body had been decapitated.
Right.
Ray Lamphere, the obvious suspect with a reason to harm Belle, was arrested and charged. Then, Asler Helgelien, brother of Andrew, Belle's final victim, arrived in Porte to assist police. He'd read about the fire in a newspaper and was still desperate to find out what happened to his brother. He questioned farmhands who had worked for Belle. He wanted to know if there had been any activity around the farm that could have been consistent with the digging of a grave.
I like this guy. He's really, getting into it.
He's on it, yeah. In fact, a farmhand told him there had been. Belle would regularly bury what she claimed was just assorted rubbish that she needed to get rid of. The farmhand had been asked to help level off the filled-in holes. On investigating the most recent of these holes, Asler and the farmhand found the body of Andrew Helgelien. Well, they found his head, his hands, and his feet.
Right.
An investigation began, and over the next 2 days, a total of 11 buried sacks were found to contain, quote, arms hacked from the shoulders down, and masses of human bone wrapped in loose flesh that dripped like jelly. Gosh, why did I include this? Sorry about
such a visceral description.
The body of Belle's foster daughter, Jenny Olsen, as you may have guessed, was also discovered on the property. Newspapers exploded with stories of Belle Gunness, the Indiana Ogress, the Black Widow, Hell's Belle, and even Mistress of the Castle of Death.
Well, that's maybe going a bit far.
The farm became an attraction even to out-of-state visitors with morbid curiosity. Opportunist vendors sold cake, popcorn, and ice cream at the farm.
Oh, now, Guys. Really?
A so-called Gunness stew was invented.
No. I don't like
Some
that.
kind of marketing thing. I think that when we talk about the present day, you often hear people sort of talking about how modern world is so like depraved and everyone's so, you know, there's like things are like somehow more like violent or worse now. I think people just don't realize just how disgusting humans have always been and how like probably worse in the past. Like people were like sociopathically like, you know, did not care about, like they were just kind of using people's deaths as like opportunities to market products and like, you know, just cynical stuff. And also just so obsessed with like death and violence and gore and gruesome stuff, just as we are now. Like nothing has really changed. But I think people think the world today is like somehow more depraved than the world back then, and I just don't agree with that.
Well, it's like, on the one hand, anyone who has access to internet can like immediately access unlimited quantities of like extremely violent media. On the other hand, you used to be able to go and see people get like beheaded in public. You know what I mean?
And often when people are talking about like the good old days when you could like leave your door unlocked in the 60s and 70s, and I'm like, hang on a second, wasn't that like the heyday of serial killing? You know, 60s, 70s, 80s, wasn't it like just worse than ever? So yeah, I don't necessarily agree with the assessment of that. But anyway, reports flooded in of countless missing men who had headed to La Porte to answer Belle's newspaper ads, though you know, most of them couldn't be confirmed conclusively as victims. And although they found a lot of remains, you know, this isn't that kind of time where you can run people through DNA databases and stuff like that. Rumours grew that Belle had torched the house herself in order to fake her own death and escape. With Andrew's brother sniffing around and her relationship with Ray in tatters, she may have thought she was about to be exposed. Shortly before the fire, Belle's bank accounts were apparently drained of most of their contents. And allegedly, Belle purchased kerosene on the way home from the lawyer's office, as well as some toys for her children. Then there was the body. Everyone knew Belle to be this heavy-set woman who was tall and strong, as I mentioned earlier, but the headless body found in the basement seemed much too small and slight. A piece of a denture was found in the debris, but although the local dentist testified that this was part of work he'd made for Belle, not everyone was convinced that this was conclusive, because it was just part of a piece of dental work. And, you know, people were just not convinced by that.
Yeah.
After all, if Belle had faked her death, she could have simply removed her dentures and left them there.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not exactly proper evidence. But Ray Lamphere was convicted of the arson, though he was acquitted of murder. They couldn't conclusively say that he'd murdered anyone, but they thought that he set the house on fire.
She had the forethought to be like, oh, I think he may kill me and burn the farm down. But then was seen purchasing the tools to do that. Like, you know, it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to think that she might have had something to do with this.
At first, Ray protested his innocence, but once in prison, the floodgates apparently opened. He told a fellow inmate that Belle would spike her visitors' coffee, strike them over the head, and then dismember them. Some remains would be fed to the pigs. Ray would dig holes to bury the bodies, which he referred to as planting.
As what?
Planting?
Oh.
It's very, like, grim sort of way to talk about it. Though he denied being involved in the fire at the farm, he claimed that the body attributed to Belle was that of a housekeeper, whom Belle had murdered, decapitated, dressed in her own clothes, and placed in the basement with her dentures before absconding. She would have been fabulously wealthy from the rewards of her crimes and well poised to start a new life. So, you know, and at this time, it's not hard. You literally just go somewhere else and say, hi, my name's like Anne Johnson or whatever. And then it's just like taken as the truth.
So he knew the whole time. I was wondering if he was like semi-oblivious to...
At first, he was saying that he had no idea, and when he was in prison, he started admitting it.
Mm.
In 1931, a woman was arrested for poisoning a man and trying to steal from him. The victim was Norwegian-American, and the female perpetrator, some thought, looked a lot like Belle Gunness. It was even said she carried a photograph of some children who resembled Belle's. The woman died in jail of tuberculosis as she awaited trial. In 2007, almost 100 years after Belle's death, the remains thought to be her body from the house had been exhumed so that DNA could be compared with samples taken from envelopes Belle had licked.
God.
Which is insane that they
That's
kept all
crazy.
the stuff. But unfortunately there wasn't enough of a sample, like the envelope sample was just too degraded and too small. So they couldn't really compare it. So it looks as though we'll never know the true fate of Belle Gunness. It would seem Belle was a person with no record of traumatic childhood or any experiences that might help partially explain her future behaviour in the way that we have for many serial killers. But there is one story that might be meaningful, although nobody can say how true it might be. It's said that when she was 18 years old and still living in Norway, Belle became pregnant. While attending a local dance, a man from a prestigious wealthy family attacked her, kicking her in the abdomen and causing her to have a miscarriage. The motivations for this aren't clear. I would wonder if he fathered the child, since in the story it makes it seem like an accidental pregnancy outside of marriage, which I assume was frowned upon. But I don't have that information. I'm just kind of embellishing the facts. Well, the so-called facts. So I'm presuming a story around this. She's pregnant. She's only 18 years old. She gets attacked by a man.
She's not married.
Yeah, a man attacks her and causes her to have a miscarriage. This seems like that. But either way, the police weren't very interested in pursuing the case because of the man's status. And no charges were brought. It's said that Belle's personality saw a dramatic change after this event and that she was never the same. So the man, he later died of unknown stomach problems thought to be cancer, but who knows if that was her first victim, a revenge killing, or if it was a coincidence. But yeah, that's sort of a story that comes up as like a potential traumatic incident in her life that could have caused her to feel like hatred against, like, I guess, men at large, or wanting to sort of take revenge, take wealthy men for what they have.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, even if as she's preparing to, you know, burn her farm down and kill her children, you said she bought toys for them, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, and the woman who was later seen and presumed to be her carries their picture around with her. So there is this kind of love and attachment to the children, but at the same time, this like absolutely cold-blooded, like murderous side as well. That's like,
yeah, it's like she loves them, but she's totally willing to use them in any way that she kind of can, and sort of just see them as a victim of like circumstance rather than her own self.
She loves them to the point where it's convenient, because once you're on the run, you can't be having 3 kids tagging along. So,
and up until they start asking questions, a la Jenny.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does seem that way. I do think, based on the evidence that was there about the body that was found, the fact that it didn't have a head, there's just a scrap of a denture.
Yeah. Was the housemaid ever found that Ray said was like...
Well, I'm gonna guess no. Like,
so, because then, like, surely that makes it fairly obvious that he's not lying about it.
I think the problem here, though, is that at this time, people are so transient with absolutely there's no
record of anything.
Administration, you know, keeping track of people's movements around the world. At this point, it's quite common for people to be farmhands and like just move around tending different farms to like make money, and men live that kind of transient lifestyle, and for women it would be the same, doing like farm work or like housekeeping or nannying or whatever it is, and they would just kind of move around. So keeping track of, like, I guess, lower class people, if You'd say it like that would be like quite difficult because they were leading that sort of lifestyle. So yeah, I feel like the fact that this housekeeper is just something that someone that Ray says lives there.
That's true, I guess.
So you don't know that that's true, but
it's also like, what does he have any reason to lie at this point?
Odd that this person didn't have a head and the only part of the head was a small piece of Belle's denture. I mean, that seems like a faked death to me.
Yeah.
And also with the description of kind of that her physicality was different. Obviously, it's hard to tell when someone's body burns. It might shrink in some ways.
Yeah, but still, like, this, I assume the skeleton would be like, I don't know.
Belle sounds like a large, like she would leave a large body behind. She would have big bones. She's like built that way. She's not overweight per se. She's large. She's tall. So, her skeleton wouldn't change that much, I don't think.
No, I think it totally seems like she faked her death, and
yeah, so I believe that
like
she did.
Everything points in that direction.
Yes, and I think I think that it's not unreasonable to conclude that she got away with it, potentially started trying to start that up again, and ended up dying. Which is in prison.
If you've gone away with it, just leave it at that. That's
the thing, though. I don't think people that have that kind of thing can. So that is the case of Belle Gunness. A very interesting mystery at the end, which I hope everyone found intriguing. I don't think we've had a potential faked death on here so far.
I don't think so.
So let us know what you think. If you think Belle, or maybe she survived. Maybe the other woman was just another woman who was a poisoner, and maybe there was nothing. There's no evidence necessarily that was her. So maybe she lived out her life. You never know. Don't forget to subscribe, and that we are on social media. Follow us on Instagram at A Podcast About Murder, Facebook, A Podcast About Murder with no E, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Search channels for A Podcast About Murder. Please do like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and give us a fantastic rating, as usual. If you have any suggestions for the show, we're always open to those as well. You can even send us an email. It's apodcastaboutmurder@outlook.com. As always, have a great weekend.
See you next week.
Seems like a somewhat abrupt ending, but yes. Our classic sign-off of mumbling into nothingness.